And so now we're going to move on to our next session, introducing facilitator James Balzar. James is a Sydney-based sustainability policymaker and practitioner. He is currently undertaking the Next Generation Foresight Practitioners NJFP Fellowship with the School of International Futures. His fellowship focuses on the future of extreme heat governance in global cities, with a particular focus on Sydney and Singapore. James has a background in government, think tanks, and social enterprise, with his work exploring how to create a more sustainable and resilient world for current and future generations. He hopes to instill stronger anticipatory governance practices with government organizations as they can ensure long-term systematic change in how policy is formulated and implemented. And joining him, we have Katie Cooper. Katie is practicing futurist who works with organizations and communities to develop future stories. Grounded in place-based storytelling, our future stories help shape strategic plans and action plans for now having identified preferred futures to work towards. And so thank you so much for being here, and we look forward. Take it. Showtime.
Thanks, Lisa. Great job to the last crew. We really enjoyed that interactive session. It's beautiful to be here today, and James and I are going to take you through a conversation. It is a bit of a weaving conversation. We've got a couple of tools that we're going to share throughout the process, but it really is about the conversation itself and talking about where we're headed with particularly youth agency and youth voice today. So we're going to start with an introduction. So James, how about you share a little bit about you, what you're working on right now, and something that's not in your bio for the crew to hear.
Thank you very much, Katie, and thank you very much for the last session. I thought that was very well designed and very well thought out. So as introduced, I'm James Balzar. I'm based in Sydney, and I'm currently undertaking the Next Generation Foresight Practitioners Fellowship, which is part of the School of International Futures. My background primarily is in government, but prior to that, I was also in social enterprise and NGOs. So my big passion and how this relates to this session is looking at how we combine bottom-up advocacy and top-down public sector efforts to create best practice governance outcomes. And therefore, my interest is in governance futures, which is basically how do we achieve that synergy of top-down and bottom-up governance in the short, medium, and long term. That's the crux of my interest and my focus, and why I'm here today with Katie. What's not in my bio is I'm a huge pug lover. I love pugs, the breed of pugs. I've got a pug called Abby. So that's a fun and peculiar fact about me. I'll pass you back to you now, Katie.
Great, thanks, James. So importantly, I can share a little bit about my work. I particularly work, as mentioned by Lisa, in storytelling. So I really find that a way to help people understand futures work is to connect it to the place that they're in. We're all familiar with the place or the city that we live in, or the organisation that we're a part of, helping them go out to the future with a range of stories, a range of scenarios, a range of potential realities or plausible futures, and then come back to now and make sense of that. By making sense of that, they're then able to shape either city plans or action plans or organizational strategy. But I always find that creative process of storytelling helps people meet in the middle. So it's a bit like a Vegemite sandwich, right? So what's your simplest version of that potential future for you? And I know Vegemite sandwiches are polarizing for anyone who's not Australian, but I think it's an important way to visualize what I do in the future. The thing that might not be in my bio is that I live in Tasmania, which is a tiny island off a big island. I'm deeply passionate about the future and the environment, and I'm deeply passionate about creating systems of people and of stories and community that help shape that island in particular. So just a reminder that we are live streaming onto YouTube today. So, if you're not able to stay for the whole session, you'll be able to catch that later on. But equally, if you want to hear, if you decide your time that you want to wake up in the middle of the night, the crew will be on there as well. It is a 24-hour process or event, so it will be streaming from all over the world over the next 24 hours. So, James, I'm actually going to start with a question to the audience if we can, and I'm really keen to see in the chat who's here, how are they using futures. You know, you might say on a scale of, you know, not at all to all every day, keep it simple. How are you using futures in your daily life? And let us know who you are and where you're from. We'd really appreciate that. While everyone's starting to pop that into the chat, James, I'd love to hear more about NGFP. Why don't you talk about that while we get some idea about who's on the call today?
Yeah, well, and it's actually a great opportunity to also plug the people to apply for the NGFP's fellowship, because I think there are many budding or experienced futurists in this session who I think will be fantastic NGFP fellows. But in essence, Next Generation Foresight Practitioners, or NGFP, is an initiative of the School of International Futures. And it's basically looking at how we can achieve long-term systemic and intergenerational fairness using futures and foresight principles and methodologies. And so they run a number of hubs, including the Climate and Energy Hub, Intergenerational Fairness Hub, Rural Futures Hub, etc., trying to deal with long-term systematic futures change in those thematics aligned to those hubs. The fellowship is assigned to people who want to run their own projects and get support and some funding to scale up, or to at least just to begin their own futures project, looking at building systemic futures capacity and long-term change. So as alluded to in the introduction, my focus is on extreme heat governance in Sydney and Singapore. That's the focus of my fellowship.
Fantastic. I think I saw that applications are open for this year's.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I believe they are.
Yeah, they just opened, I think it was only in the last 24 hours, so that's exciting. So we've got John Lim from the Future Singapore Hub. How are you going, John? Great to see you. So working in consulting with companies in banking, hospitality and technology. Welcome. Now, I also saw Scott. He's got his camera on. Thank you. Where are you joining us from, Scott? Oh, from Kuala Lumpur. There you go. 2 fast fingers. Beautiful. And you're using it pretty much every day, whether you want to or not. Beautiful. I love that. I've got Carol on the screen as well. Hi, Carol. Whereabouts are you from? Feel free to unmute. Nope.
Oh, yes. Hi. Hello. Oh, John, I'm also from Singapore, so you can see the background, the Singapore
Beautiful.
skyline. Yeah, and not too far from Scott at all.
Fantastic. Well, it's great to see you all, and I know that we've got about 20 other or 18 other people on the online. So if anyone feels like sharing who they are and where they're from, you're more than welcome to over the next few minutes. James, I've got another question for you now. So you're obviously working in youth policy or in policy around climate in the future. One of the things that we talked about before we did this session whilst we were planning was how you felt about youth advocacy. And so I'm keen for you to paint a picture of the present state that you think youth advocacy is sitting in.
I think it's a great question and something that gets asked a lot. And there's a lot to unpack with regard to youth activism and youth as an agent of change, especially bottom-up change from the perspective of governance. And the analogy or the metaphor I would use personally is that youth have built a ladder, but there's no hooks on the end of the ladder to latch it onto a wall or to latch it onto something to climb up. I think we are at a time where social media and disruptive media technologies, whether that be TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, etc., are enabling a great democratization of media. You no longer need to have enormous capital, connections, and time to foster a show on, a public broadcaster or a big media channel to get your message out there. You can do it with the phone in your pocket for very little cost. That means youth are exposed and are able to expose themselves to the world and disseminate their thoughts and their ideas around issues, particularly with regard to climate and sustainability, very easily. So we have a new paradigm coming out in the world with that democratization of media. However, the top-down paradigm of the public sector governance model is still stuck in 20th century thinking. Our institutions have not caught up with the pace and the tempo and the democratization of contemporary activism, especially from youth. So how we reconcile those two, I think, is a very important question. I've got some thoughts on that I won't go into now, but you asked me to just summarize my thought on the current state of youth activism. That's probably the best way I would sum it up if you were to ask me that question.
Beautiful. Thanks, James. And I love that you use the metaphor there. So, and I'm sure that there are a number of people on the call that are familiar with Sahal Inatala and his CLA process, so causal layered analysis. What we've started with is just that idea of the metaphor. What is it that you hold as the story for the current situation, either for yourself or for what you're a part of? And so James and I, in our conversations before today, just started to use the process of defining a metaphor for the current state. And James has used that ladder without hooks on the end for it to be stabilized or hung from. So I love that as a metaphor. What we're going to do today is using that as a way to start to define what might be a metaphor that's more appropriate or help steer us towards a future that we want to have in youth advocacy. So we're going to start to play a little bit in the chat, or you're welcome to unmute and jump in. But I'm really keen for people to think about what might be our story or our metaphor, the thing that is true for a potential future around youth advocacy. So if we're a ladder with no hook at the moment, what might we like to move towards? Any ideas there? Feel free to pop them in the chat. And while people are thinking on that, because it's a big one, James, what are your ideas?
I think, obviously, we know what we want to get to. We want to metaphorically put those hooks on the ladder. So the question, we know why we need to do that. We understand the what, we know the why and the what, which is great. But the hard bit is the how. And there's a lot of ways you could answer that. But a lot of it comes down to how we change the way our institutions, as in top-down public sector institutions, work to collaborate more effectively with the bottom-up activism of youth. That's always kind of the thesis I focus on personally. Now, there's been a lot of talk about...
James, I'm going to challenge that just a little bit, and then I'm going to let you get back into flow. Do you think the ladder is the metaphor for the future? Like, is it a ladder? And I'm interested in other people's thoughts, because to me that's a hierarchical kind of layered construct in itself. And I'm just wondering if people think there's a better artifact or a better metaphor as part of that piece. And then I'll let you keep your chain of thought going while people are thinking about it.
That's a fantastic point, though, right? Because, I mean, we often think about, and traditional governance models as they stand to this day are still very hierarchical, but it's actually a good point. Is there perhaps a way in which we can achieve change without the need for a strict hierarchy between top-down and bottom-up? Because often in public policy discussions, it's kind of framed as this dichotomy, top-down versus bottom-up governance. But is there a way where we can just have more horizontally integrated governance outcomes in collaboration between civil society stakeholders or between civil society and the private sector without really even needing that more hierarchical top-down actor, the public sector involved? So how do we achieve those governance outcomes that perhaps are more democratized and more horizontal? And in particular, what does that mean for youth activism and advocacy, including in, but not exclusively to, climate change and sustainability activism. So it's a great point you've raised there, Katie. And I definitely will be interested in seeing what other thoughts people have as well. Now, John just mentioned something. Senior job roles no longer based on ageist limits of supposed experience. Yep, I think there's a very good point there, but rather true competency and demonstrated portfolios. Imagine a world with teenagers who have led sports teams to be managers. I think that is a very good point, John. And I think in both the private and the public sector in particular, there is an emphasis on doing your time. You know, you got to do 3 years to get to this point in the hierarchy, 10 years to get to this point. These are slightly arbitrary numbers. I do agree. I think there's a very good point to be pondered there. I'm not sure what you think, Katie.
So actually, Scott's popped into the chat the idea of keeping it simple, perhaps focusing on a value. So, and that value is respect. So, you know, where we have a deficit between various peoples, as well as humans and nature, generationally. I'm a Gen X, and I'm absolutely conscious of being in the middle of the world that's changing at the moment. And perhaps we can reevaluate respect, and I like that idea. And I wonder whether or not the idea of the metaphor being something like a swarm. You know, when you think about a flock of swallows or a swarm of bees, the way that they move in like a biomimicry or a pattern, it doesn't have a single leader, it has many. And the idea of if our metaphor for advocacy could be around a swarm or a flock, how might we be able to, you know, solve some significant challenges around youth advocacy? I'm keen on people's thoughts about that. Scott's got his eyebrows up and he's nodding his head, so I'm thinking I got there.
I'd love to hear more about it, Scott. Feel free to take your mark off, Scott. I like the idea about also changing values, right? And this is actually something I'm looking at in my NGFP fellowship. We often think, and in fact, I often think in quite a technical methodological way to change things. And you need a bit of that. But culture eats strategy for breakfast is a common saying in organizations. And I think at a societal level, you could say the same thing. How we change culture, values, and mindsets is actually probably a more powerful, systematic change in the way we do things than a technical or methodological approach to change things. I'm not sure if you have any more thoughts on that, Scott, or if you would like to turn your mic on and contribute verbally.
Finding a bit to unmute. Yeah, that's okay. Oh, good. He did mention in there, I like this one, a warp pipe, like from Super Mario Brothers. So it's like, you know, you enter in one field and then you're through to the next field or the next level or whatever that looks like, or the other side of the factory, depending on where you're playing. What do you think about that, Carol?
I might ask to unmute, and then maybe that might help people unmute. There we go.
Yes.
Yay.
I'll do the same to you, Scott, see if it works afterwards as well. It might be the solution.
Yes. Right. Now Scott can talk too. Okay.
Right, jump in.
I don't really have a visual metaphor yet for what I have in mind, but definitely it isn't the letter, but I think of it, I don't know why, I think of it in waves. And I think about that, how maybe it's because there's a Chinese proverb saying that is about looking at generations in terms of waves. So the Chinese proverb of saying that seeing waves as representing generations. So I think of it that way, and I think I wanted to also respond to earlier on about this whole idea of like non-hierarchy. So I was just at one of our tertiary institutions here in Singapore this morning, running a whole series of mock pitches for students who are thinking up about new ideas to use technology to solve some of our problems of the future. And one of the teams pitched an idea to do with the way learning can be done in future, in the classrooms of the future. And I love one slide where they had these simple words, which are simply for students by students. And that really was pretty wow for me, because I thought about it. We have so conventionally thought about learning and education as the teacher teaching the students. But here, the students are basically saying, no, we can actually create, and they were creating metaverses. So these were students working in studying animation and game design and all that. And they have decided that they can create their own vehicles for learning. They can create how they would like to learn. And they can put all those content and the storytelling and the gamification and all of that into how they wish to learn. And they can create these things for the younger students. So the whole idea of, breaking the traditional hierarchical structures that we're so used to in schools. To me, I think that was one of my biggest takeaways from this morning.
Beautiful. Thanks so much. That's such a great one. All too often, policy is being developed in isolation to the people that are most impacted by it. And we've certainly had an experience here recently in Tasmania around youth incarceration. So young people who are offenders in the prison system have had a whole inquiry around their distance from their ability to influence the policy development around how they're incarcerated and cared for. Thankfully, we have a champion in our Commissioner for Children and Young People who is attempting to reshape that going forward, which is really exciting. So I like that, bringing, the by youth for youth approach to that. Yeah. James, what are your thoughts on that?
It's a wonderful sentiment. Yeah. And it speaks to the democratization of knowledge that's been enabled in the digital era. It's amazing how much students now can learn by themselves using YouTube and TikTok. I don't mean that flippantly. Quite seriously, there's a lot of good educational material on those apps. And it's a very naive for education systems to not leverage that and to work with students with the knowledge that they have access to so much knowledge. And to not recognize that is going to lead to a stagnant, undemocratized, overly homogenized education system, as we see in many contexts in this day. And Scott's got his mic off, so I'm not sure if Scott's interested in contributing.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in. This is so going off of the hierarchy bit. I'm all for that end to hierarchy and such. The issue we run into is that if there's no driver, things just don't get done. You can have these wonderful, nearly egalitarian conversations or workshops or classes or something along those ways. But if there's nothing, and unfortunately, the only way we can do that is to fall into those old hierarchical structures of leadership, and so I think we just have to take it. Maybe we have to go further. Just have to go deeper, right? So you just keep looking at the various different whether it's different disciplines or different fields of inquiry that we haven't quite looked into. It's very tough. I don't know. It's very difficult because I think it's just so inbuilt, which kind of gets me back to what I was saying about, because I'm, in full disclosure, I'm not a cultural relativist. So there's but you still have to, there's a very delicate balance with various cultures, whether that's sort of a contemporary culture that has built up either in a workplace, in a school, in a community, even within a nation, while there is the more indigenous cultural identities behind some of our ethnicities and where we come from, our language, even our generation. And so how to balance all of that is very very challenging. And so if we have new ways of doing that, and that's why I think going back to just values, because the beauty of a simple value, that's why I put respect, for example, is it crosses so many different cultures, and it can even, but I think we shouldn't be afraid to critique other cultures too. I think there's a lot of wrong in this like defend all cultures, notion. So I think it's just overall, I guess the overall hypothesis is that we live in very extreme times where you have to be this or that and nothing in between. And so that just kind of gets back to the greater challenge. So I think you guys are tapping into some really cool stuff here. So unfortunately, I
Yeah,
don't know if
beautiful.
I have many solutions, but it's very cool thinking. So dig it.
Yeah, beautiful. Scott, that's really stimulated for me the idea. So I'm from Lutruwita, Tasmania, Nipaluna, Hobart, and I acknowledge the elders of the Tasmanian Aboriginal community who are the longest serving or longest continuous culture in the world. One of the things that is beautiful about their way of living or their way of viewing the world is that an elder and in a similar culture. Auntie Cheryl just joined us from New Zealand, so I'd love for her to pop her video on whenever she's ready. The idea that an elder is helps shape the way that things are based on the past as opposed to the future. But sorry, not as opposed, as well as drawing out the long now, so into the future. But an elder helps shape that and make sense of that and understand that. And I think that's a really interesting piece, is how do we get this metaphor of youth advocacy, if it's a time warp or a smart mob, which was another suggestion in there, or the waves, to create a space where we're able to both look backwards to come forwards around whatever the advocacy or policies that we're developing, but also push forward in a really beautiful way. Good afternoon, Cheryl. So lovely of you to join us. Oh, unmute. Hang on. I'll ask you to unmute.
There you go.
Great, James. Thank you.
Kia ora, great to join you, even if I am a little later. And, I sort of thought I'd pop in. Such an exciting topic.
Beautiful. Such a good day
I'm
too.
a big Cheryl fan, so Cheryl, you're more than welcome. I'm very glad to see you online.
So I think if we think about great bringing in culture, Scott, I think it's amazing to make that call, and but also not to be specifically driven by one or the other, I think was one of the points that you were making, but that need to respect, well, values, by holding a respect that's a value that's common, and one that you popped in there was respect, but it could be equally others. So I'm interested in your thoughts that start with James around if this metaphor for the future of youth advocacy was something like a youth for youth approach, so a smart mob or a swarm or a flock, or a warp pipe like Mario Brothers that Scott brought in. What would be true if that metaphor were true? I'm interested in your thoughts. What else would be true?
I guess when you say what else would be true, would it be more sort of what are the underlying realities or the underlying principles? Yeah. I mean, what would have to be true is that our systems enable that swarm to cohere, to sort of coherently come together, to have coherent, well-directed advocacy. So this actually touched on what Scott said, and I agree with Scott as well. Democratization does admittedly lead to a lack of coordination sometimes. And hierarchy, while very coordinated, can be very stale and can be brittle in how stringent it is. But the benefit there with hierarchy is it can be controlled more easily. So the question is, if we want to have that swarm metaphor, how do we enable the systems to exist to have a coordinated yet democratized system? That's, I think, the best mix in advocacy.
Great. Beautiful. So if it was coordinated and it was democratized, I'm interested in what others might think about what would also be true. So let's build on this like a bit of a world building futures map. If it was democratized and it was a swarm like, what would also be true? Scott's added in a circular approach to time. I like this one. Fill this one in for me.
And Sahil in your tool actually talks about that a fair bit. He's into sort of the quite esoteric models, mental models of thinking about futures. And he has referred to something quite similar to that in a fair bit of his work.
Yeah, it's actually quite interesting because I feel like traditional Western thought are the only is the only area that hasn't figured this one out. The whole because I mean people have been talking about this cyclical nature of time. I mean, I do a lot of Islamic thought here in Malaysia, so we have Ibn Khaldun who wrote the Muqaddimah, you know, back in I can't remember the years, but thousands or hundreds of years ago. So these aren't new notions, I guess, but perhaps we could put them in a newer context where if you know, the idea that the elder is the locus of all past wisdom. But if you think of time in a cyclical fashion, then what was past will be future to an extent. And so really the locus then becomes what's the word I'm looking for? Decentralized. Essentially, it's, you know, everyone is a locus of wisdom, whether it's future, past, present, in that sort of sentiment. So, but it's a beautiful thing that I think when we're going back and looking at these, because indigenous wisdom, I think that people who are in that research space are the saints of the modern age and need to continue working on the space because it's digging up some of these notions that are I think there's a profound simplicity in that, where just this simple switch can really radically change things going up from there.
Cheryl, I see your response in the chat. To unpack that one for me.
Yeah, I'm just I'm interested in the sort of the islands of difference and coherence, and the how you build those together, but that they don't have to be something that exists for a long period of time. It's that liminality and that sort of connection between, and then the dispersing, so it's less owned and doesn't necessarily have to have a tight structure, and then the part of that coherency is the elders, kaumatuas, as we would call them here, or adult allies, embracing the islands, but letting them be their own thing. However, being the cheerleaders, being the connectors, being the stepping into the space and stepping out, and letting the youth also be the leaders. So it's that fluidity, I think, is critical.
Beautiful. That links, Carol, to what you were talking about before around that Chinese proverb of the waves. Do you want to link that back in your where your thinking's going?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I am thinking about the waves and thinking about the proverbs and how the Chinese proverbs a lot about how the waves from behind are pushing the waves in front. And this whole idea of like the newer generation coming over, but we know that as waves go, it's a continuous thing, right? The waves will go down and there's the undercurrent and it pushes back and then it repeats itself. So it's not like it stops there, and it's not a linearity to it. So I think that there are some parallels there as well. I'm also thinking about it in terms of how, and those of us who have an interest in linguistics and things like that will also realize that how we perceive time across different cultures is very much dependent on the language as well. And certain parts of the world, because of the kind of language that dominates in that part of the world, does then have a more linear concept of time, and how in other cultures it's not that way. And I think it's very interesting to think about how then that affects how they view about futures. So I absolutely love that comment from Scott about taking that more circular approach to time, and thinking about how like the more indigenous populations and tribes will view it so completely differently.
Becky, thank you for your comment in the chat. Climbing multi-spiraled intertwined staircases. So you think about that, which is a bit like if you've ever been in the Museum of the Future in Dubai, you're never quite sure which floor you're going to come out of. But you know, it's really beautiful as a metaphor also. James, I'm interested in if we, you know, we have this kind of idea around holding a value that is important, which Scott put into the chat, which is amazing, around respect being a potential example of that. We look at a metaphor around this idea of something more fluid than a ladder, which was our current metaphor, a ladder with no hooks to anchor that youth advocacy. And then we think about what we've talked about around the ebbing and flowing of a generational. And I love what Cheryl called out there around being able to hold a younger generation without constraining or owning, holding that really beautifully. If those things were true, James, what impact do you think that would have practically on advocacy? Like, how would it look different?
The example I think about is there's a great organization based in Taiwan, and they're spreading out globally now. And it's called Gov, but it's spelled G0V. And basically their whole thing is they're radically decentralized as an organization. So they're a radically decentralized advocacy organization that work through a decentralized network of civil society actors or just independent citizens who gather data, who run polls, who write articles on their platform, basically. And even during COVID-19, they were able to collate data very quickly from all the different members to be able to map, where the biggest hotspots are for COVID-19, and then actually advocate to the government faster than the Taiwanese government even could about where to allocate resources. So I always look to that example because I think it's an interesting case study of where you can use very technical digital means as a way of creating very decentralized flat networks of advocacy and change. Something like that, I think, is in a very practical sense how you could do it. But I'd be interested to hear what other people have to say as well, and if there are other case studies that also exist. And if you want to add anything to that, Cheryl, I'll be happy to hear your thoughts.
I had a thought bubble. So I'm not sure where it was going, but
I saw it though. Yeah,
I know. Yeah. I was, as you were talking about that, I was thinking back to 13 years ago during our earthquakes and the emergence of the student volunteer army, who didn't wait for permission because they would have been still waiting, and they just got on with the job, and they used the really simple technologies of Facebook, social media, and did an amazing job and turned around people's perceptions of what university students are. And so the metaphor of like, there's a busload of university students that have just arrived in our street. You would have once been absolutely terrified that they were coming to wreck the street, and instead they've got shovels and wheelbarrows and so on. And so it's the being able to make some small change quickly to be noticed. It's I'm not. That's why it was just a thought bubble. But that whole not waiting for a formal structure to be given to you or to work within the formal structures, not to break the laws, but to just say, what if, what next, and have a go at something and use it as proof of concept.
Yeah. And Adam Kahane, quite a famous futures academic, talks about self-organizing networks and the need to have a decentralized yet conjoined system where you don't have nodes that join to each other, but you actually just have no nodes at all, in theory, and you just join the dots amongst society, and whatever the method is to join those dots, whether it be Facebook, Instagram, whether it be WhatsApp, etc. You can use digital avenues, as we've seen in 2 case studies here, to join those dots and create that swarm. So it's some very interesting practical case studies.
I was having a great conversation this afternoon in the present in Australia, which is in the future for other people, around sustainability. So climate change action, adaptation, policy, etc. And that Costa Rica are quite progressive in this space. And one of the things that she's in inquiry about, and I'll throw to the future when Costa Rica come online, around how are they organising or when they have a really distributed, they seem to have quite a distributed local government and government equity system. So in health, for example, their health budget is spread across the whole population in a fair and equitable way. So you're able to have innovation pop up as a result because of that distributed nature. So I wonder in Australia or in South Pacific or in this part of the world, Asia Pacific, whether or not we could find a topic that we could create the container for people to swarm within. That was, hashtag safe, I suppose, enough for people to just have a go at creating policy, shaping action. What might the impact of that look like? Any ideas, James?
One of the big things we've heard a lot of discussion about, particularly in the UK have been quite leading in this, is citizens' assemblies, which is an interesting way to sort of democratize and decentralize advocacy amongst what are effectively mini parliaments or mini juries of sorts that enable a very structured, systematic avenue for advocacy amongst the general citizenry of a country. With regard to decentralization of government services, you can have that, which is one way of promoting decentralizing advocacy, particularly amongst the everyday citizens of a country. But as you've alluded to as well, there's also a question around to what extent does decentralizing the actual public sector institutions of a country lead to more decentralized bottom-up advocacy? And that especially applies to youth, for example. So, a lot of discussion in the UK, funnily enough, is also about how centralised London, the Westminster and the national government is in London, compared to the lack of decentralisation to local governments, as one practical example, and how that leads to sort of slow, out of touch decision making from a top-down perspective. So I think citizens' assemblies are one way to start thinking about this, but amongst many. We could be here for hours if you wanted to, but I'll just leave it at that one example.
Yeah, I love that, James. I think if we think about a three horizons model, the ability to prove out something like a citizens' assembly in this first horizon around something that you're passionate about, climate change and adaptation and readiness for impact or adapting to impact. If we're able to host something like that or hold, to use Cheryl's thought bubble that she put in there, what might that look like in our first horizon? Welcome any sort of thoughts on that?
Just I think it was today's earlier feed, there was information that said, James, that the citizens' assemblies that idea has been canned by UK Parliament.
Really?
That's hot off the press. Yep. And so that brings to mind to me the difficulty of trying to find a coherent thing that could be shared across countries when we're at the whim of governments. And so it looks different from country to country. Certainly in New Zealand, we've gone from a left-leaning government to a right-leaning government, and there are huge issues with for Maori with the treaty and quite changing legislation. And so it's really, really difficult for experienced adults to be able to work in that space. But my wondering is, what do we do that supports young people to not give up when they can see such a change happens and they lose hope, because hope is a critical part of a youth conversation.
It sure is. And the elements, the three sort of dimensions of hope being, you know, a goal or a vision, agency, and a pathway to get there. And it is really interesting what's happening in New Zealand. I wonder if the Welsh model of the Commissioner for Future Generations that is currently shaping some of the UN thinking around the Forum for the Future could be something that might, you know, draw out the safety, I suppose, if it's a more globally accepted model where change must be measured against a series of goals that have been legislated before change is made, then you know, perhaps that's something that we can move through. I'm not sure if anyone else is familiar with the Welsh model. I know, Cheryl, you hosted the previous commissioner.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting space too. So you'll have heard from the previous discussions with Alice and Sam from Tokona Te Raki, the Māori Futures Collective, which is based here in Ōtautahi Christchurch too. So they have a team of people next week who are heading over to Wales to spend some time looking at the Welsh model, and I think that ability to share ideas and then bring them back, because they will then impact, will design work that can be used for rangatahi, which are young Māori youth, and so from an Indigenous perspective. So yeah, the more we can see those conversations, I think the Summit for the Future is a possible avenue for a wider connection.
Mm.
So I think we've got some good. Oh, sorry, you go, James.
No, you go, Katie. All good.
No, I'm jumping
Okay.
in.
I was just saying it's interesting because I think we're going to sort of go into the 3 horizons model. H1 is disrupting business as usual. It's almost kind of those quick wins in a way. You know, how can we find those quick wins that at least build momentum? Then H2 is the disruptive innovations that carry that over to the longer term, which is H3. So I always think of H1 as something where you've just got to start the discussion and get something out the door, so to speak, that even if it doesn't last very long, it gets people thinking a different way. So citizens' assemblies, regardless of whether they're going to go ahead or not for the long term in the UK, or even the Indigenous voice to Parliament here in Australia, which unfortunately that referendum failed, you know, it at least starts a discussion that gets people thinking in that H1 context about how we can overcome business as usual. The question then is about H2, the disruptive innovations. And this is perhaps where models or solutions to democratize advocacy become go beyond just a model, and we start looking at the implementation of them and the actual sort of practical platforms like social media, like, you know, assemblies that don't require government, etc. So I'm not sure how well I articulated that, but basically, if H1 is just getting the ball rolling and getting some ideas out there, even if they don't stick for very long, if it at least gets us to H2 with the disruptive innovations, hopefully then we can bridge it to the longer term H3. That's sort of where my thinking lies with these things.
Great. Any thoughts from those that have been interacting today about that? We've all got our thinking faces on. You've got them thinking, James.
And Cheryl, Alice Diamond's not in the session, is she? Because I think she'll be great to. Oh, okay, that's all right.
Yeah,
I would love to have called her upon if that were the case.
Yeah, I think she was earlier on, so she'd probably gone to organise the rest of her day before the end of it. So I really love that 3 horizons model. And if we look back, we've only got a few minutes left of our session in this 24-hour journey that we've got. So if we look back, we really started to have a look at what was a metaphor for the current environment for youth advocacy and policy making, and the ability to make change. And that was, James, you brought that beautiful ladder without the hook into the room. Where we went to was we started to explore and unpack what a new metaphor might look like for the future of youth advocacy. And we talked about a swarm and a smart mob or a warp pipe. Thanks for that one, Scott. I really like that one. But then we started to move into a much more organic kind of feel around waves and islands and how do we hold them a little bit more. I really enjoyed the conversation around what would be true if that new metaphor were true for us, and we really started to unpack some actions that perhaps we could take in this some quick wins in this first horizon with citizen assemblies, or some trial experimentation with a piece of policy or advocacy that was perhaps a little safer than which is, I think, just an adult version of trying to control things, to be truthful, when I think about my language. And then, we finished up with the 3 horizons model, and Scott's just popped a comment in the chat around the H2. You wonder if it has to be a disruption. Talk to me a little bit more. What kind of different approach do you think we could take?
I wish I had this better thought out. I just feel like it's just the metaphor of the Molotov cocktail through the window as the only way to get change. I don't like it. I'm a nonviolence kind of guy. I'm a very pacifist, PC kind of guy. So I'm just wondering if there's a better way, because I think in doing that, you're just going to have more of the. And I brought up the U.S. congressional hearings with all the tech giants, which was just. I watched that and I was like, what are we doing? What is going on? Like, everything wrong with everything can be encompassed in those hearings. And so I'm just like, there has to be a different way. Like, I get it. It's the whole move fast and break things, which I'm also against. I'm like, do we really have to break things? Can we is there another way that I don't, and
Yeah.
and I don't mean to be like, let's all sit in a circle and sing Kumbaya, but it's, I feel like it's a bit better
Yeah.
than
Well, I think
windows.
if maybe if you think of it as that, riding the curves instead of, moving through to disruption. It's like, as if you've got a standard growth curve, right? And there's got to be something in there that we've learnt. We've tried it, we've learnt from it, we've made sense of it. It's helped us in some way. What do we keep from that old curve in order to transition across to the new curve? And how do we help people with that change or transition? It can feel disruptive if you're not engaged in the change process, but actually being able to kind of soften or gentle it, through a set of values even, or principles around change.
No, that's very good. And I think experimentation is important. And actually, I think Cheryl should jump in because she just sent me a very interesting little message. But that you can take advantage of the luminality, but I guess I don't know. I'm just maybe my problem with the more quote unquote violent approaches to change is that they don't typically know where they're going. They need something different, and so maybe we need to start thinking about H3 before we can actually get to H2. I throw that out there.
Yeah, sorry, I thought I was responding to everyone. So yes, what I said was that Horizon 2, I think of as there's some new ideas that haven't been done before, and then the letting go. And so it's a place of messiness and intentional design that way. So there's sort of hospicing and creating, but it's also acknowledging that there will be pain associated with that, and that there are different worldviews. And just to agree also with the comment about, the Horizon 3 is the vision that you are aiming towards, and so the intentionality of H2 is where it's easy to give up. But it's a really critical design of what you're letting go, what new things, but also towards Horizon 3 of what's critical to keep, because you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah, beautiful. Absolutely lovely. So I'm just conscious of time. So James, let's summarize where we've been today and what you see as hope for the future, perhaps for this work that you're engaged in as part of your fellowship.
It's been a very quick 1 hour. I can't believe it's already been an hour. It was great. I genuinely really enjoyed that conversation, and there's a lot to unpack and to think about there. And in my case, I'm looking at extreme heat governance, and I look at it through two futures methods. So the first one, and the most substantive for my fellowship, is the Three Horizons framework, and how we shift bottom up civil society driven activism and top down public sector activism, or policy creation, perhaps I should say, over H1, H2, H3 to achieve longer term, better, systematic, extreme heat governance. So I'm going to be in Singapore in a few weeks, actually running a workshop looking at this issue at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. So if anyone wants to come and you're in Singapore, please reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I can definitely send you the calendar invite. But I'll also be doing these
You
same
might have a
workshops
couple
here
of
in
takers
Sydney.
there.
Yeah, that's good. A few Singaporeans on here. So Carol, I see your hand, and a few others as well. But yeah, I mean, one of my big passions is governance, and how do we create policy windows, for example, that get governments interested in extreme heat? How do we create a change in norms and values, a little bit like what we discussed with Scott, to think more long term and think about things in a more systemic manner, etc. So that's kind of the overview. But it's definitely, I found this session to be quite informative to that end, in that it has helped me think more critically about how I apply the Three Horizons framework from a bottom-up governance perspective in particular.
Yeah, beautiful. Thanks, James. And look, thanks everyone for contributing. I think it was an amazing conversation, and I'm really grateful to see faces and comments happening. So we're at the end of our particular time together from Australia. So we want to thank you for participating in World Futures Day, our Young Voices for 2024.